There's going to be a very different feeling around Montreal Canadiens training camp this year because for the first time in a while, the question being asked isn't going to be which prospect is ready enough to play in the NHL. The question is going to be which prospect is good enough to actually take somebody else's job. Those are completely different standards on both sides of the ledger. Now, the Canadiens aren't coming into camp desperately searching for young players to fill holes. They just went 48, 24, and 10. They made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Final. And if you look at the projected lineup as it is right now, there really aren't that many obvious vacancies to fill. Early projections have established 12 forwards already penciled into the four lines. Plus, on defense, you've got Matheson, Dobson, Hudson, Goulet, Carrier, Struble, possibly even Xhekaj if the situation settles itself. And that creates one of the most interesting stories heading into this year's camp. Because sitting directly underneath that roster are four players who don't really look like long-term AHL players anymore. And those players are Owen Beck, Florian Xhekaj, Adam Engstrom, and of course, David Reinbacher. All four spent time around Montreal last season. All four were recalled as Black Aces when Laval's season ended. And all four are going to arrive at training camp believing that they can play in the National Hockey League right now. But here's the problem. There may not be any room for them. There may not even be room for one of them unless somebody absolutely forces Kent Hughes and Marty St. Louis to consider the roster they already have. So in this episode, we're going to go through the Canadiens' bubble prospects. What does each player have working in their favor? What's standing in their way? What would they actually have to show during training camp? And most importantly, who has the best chance of forcing their way onto this team? So let's talk some puck. Now, before we get into the individual players, I think there's something important that we have to establish, right? Montreal doesn't have to rush anybody anymore. And that's probably going to make this one of the hardest Canadiens teams to crack in years. All four of these guys can still be assigned to Laval without Montreal facing the kind of waiver pressure that we've seen in the past that sometimes forces an organization into a roster decision, or a bad one for that matter. Beck, Florian Xhekaj, and Engstrom are all listed as waiver exempt, and reporting on Montreal's prospect situation has Reinbacher and Engstrom both eligible to go back to Laval without waivers as well. And that's really significant because management doesn't have to say, well, we'd better keep him because somebody might actually claim him. They can simply ask, where's this player going to develop best? And if you're David Reinbacher and the choice is between playing 21 minutes a night in Laval or sitting in the press box 3 nights out of 5 in Montreal, Laval might actually sound like the better developmental option for you. Same thing with Beck, Xhekaj, and Engstrom, although Beck and Engstrom may be very long in the tooth at this point, right? So these players aren't simply competing against the bottom of Montreal's roster. They're competing against the value of playing major minutes in Laval. That means the standard should be extremely high. You don't keep Owen Beck in Montreal because he looks like he could survive 10 minutes a night, for example. You keep him because he looks like one of your 12 best forwards. You also don't keep David Reinbacher because he's a former 5th overall pick. You keep him because he's making it impossible for you to justify sending him down. And that's why this camp could be so interesting. So let's start with the player I think could have the most frustrating training camp out of the four, because Adam Engstrom might already be NHL ready. The problem is Montreal's depth chart. Engstrom had an excellent year offensively in Laval. In 45 games, he put up 10 goals and 24 assists for a total of 34 points. That made him Montreal's highest scoring defenseman, despite only playing 45 games. He also played 15 with Montreal and produced 1 assist, finished +2, and averaged just over 13 minutes a game. And I think that's kind of important because Engstrom isn't really entering camp as an unknown prospect anymore. We've seen what he can do. He can skate at an NHL level, move the puck, activate offensively. He can transport the puck through the neutral zone without worry. And after putting up 34 points in 45 games in Laval, I'm not sure there's a whole hell of a lot left for him to prove offensively in the American Hockey League. The question is whether there's a job for his particular skill set in Montreal, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Just look at the left side of the Canadiens' defense. Lane Hudson, Mike Matheson, Kane Goulet, Jaden Struble, potentially Arber Xhekaj, depending on how that entire situation resolves itself. Engstrom isn't trying to break into a weak area of the roster because really, I don't see one. He's trying to break into arguably one of the deepest areas of the entire organization. He's also dealing with another problem. What does Engstrom give Montreal that it doesn't already have? And that's not an insult. That's just a roster construction question. If you've already got Hudson driving offense in transition, Matheson moving the puck and playing major minutes, Gooley giving you skating and two-way ability, and then Engstrom needs to show that his overall game has progressed enough that he's not simply another puck-moving option. Because that's where training camp becomes about more than just points. Think about it for a minute. The questions you ask about Engstrom are, can he defend against bigger NHL forwards? Can he close plays quickly, win enough puck battles? Can Marty St. Louis trust him late in a one-goal game? And can he play effectively when there isn't a power play role waiting for him? That's going to determine whether he can knock somebody out of the lineup, and I think Engstrom's biggest target right now may possibly be Jayden Struble. Not necessarily because they're identical players, because they're not. Because if Montreal believes Engstrom's puck movement gives them more overall value than, Struble's heavier defensive game, then suddenly there's a legitimate debate for that sixth spot. At the same time, Struble played 59 games for the Canadiens last year and was in Montreal's lineup during the Eastern Conference Final. That's not an easy player to simply leapfrog. So Engstrom may have one of the strangest camps of anybody. He could play very well, he could look completely NHL ready, and he could still end up playing in Laval. That's why I have him fourth on my list for opening night probability. Not because he's the fourth best player. There's a difference here. In fact, by November or January, an injury may make Engstrom one of the first call-ups. But if anybody is healthy on opening night, or if everybody is, the numbers game is just brutal. And that's why I see him here as the fourth guy. Now we get to the wild card in the bunch. And this might be the most entertaining player to watch during the entire camp because Florian Xhekaj has something almost nobody else in this competition has. A completely obvious identity. You don't need to wonder what kind of player Florian Xhekaj is when he comes to camp. He's 6'4", physical, aggressive. He goes to difficult areas, brings a lot of energy, and he's willing to make life miserable for the opposition. Beyond that, he's already demonstrated that there may be more offense than people originally expected from him. Last season in Laval, he scored 17 goals, had 12 assists for a total of 29 points in 64 games, and yes, 182 penalty minutes. He also received the first NHL opportunity of his career, playing in 5 games for the Habs and recording an assist while averaging just over 10 minutes a night. And that's where Xhekaj becomes fascinating because Montreal's already got a lot of players who can handle playing that kind of hockey. The question is whether it has somebody who can give Marty St. Louis exactly what Florian Xhekaj gives you from the bottom of the lineup. This isn't a player who needs a top 6 role. He doesn't need power play time. You aren't keeping him because you need him to score 25 goals for you. His path could be much simpler. Can he forecheck? Can he create turnovers? Can he play 8 to 11 minutes without becoming a defensive liability? Can he go to the net? Can he change momentum? Can he give Montreal a physical dimension without constantly putting the Canadiens shorthanded? And that last part is huge because 182 penalty minutes might look fun on a stat sheet if you like old school hockey, if you're Don Cherry, for example. But Marty St. Louis isn't going to like it if undisciplined penalties are costing the Canadiens games. There's a difference between intimidation and poor discipline, and that's kind of what's, anchored his brother a little bit. There's a difference between finishing checks and chasing them. And there's a difference between making opponents uncomfortable and making your penalty killers work overtime. And that's going to be the biggest challenge for Florian. Can he keep the edge while becoming dependable? Because if he can, then he's going to give himself a real chance. There's already been discussion around Montreal that Florian could receive every opportunity to make the club and that the bottom of the Canadiens forward lineup is much more accessible than the top side is. And then there's another wrinkle here. As of August 19th, Zach Bolduc remains unsigned along with Arber Xhekaj. I'm not predicting that Bolduc won't be back, and I'm not turning this into another contract segment because I've already done that. But until every roster spot is formally settled, there's a little bit more uncertainty around this lineup than the depth chart makes it look like. And Florian doesn't necessarily need to beat a top 9 forward. He can make the argument. If your 13th forward gives you something different, then maybe you keep him in your roster. That's a much easier argument to win for him. If Montreal wants an extra forward, he could sit for a game and then enter the lineup without needing offensive minutes to have an impact, then Florian Xhekaj fits that description perfectly. The question is whether Montreal thinks he's better off every night in Laval or whether staying with the Habs is the best place for him, and that's what he has to overcome. And the way he overcomes it is by becoming so effective in a defined NHL role that sending him down doesn't make any sense in terms of the Canadiens. That's why Florian is the biggest camp wild card right now. I wouldn't be shocked if he gets sent back to Laval. I also wouldn't be shocked if we get halfway through camp and everybody suddenly starts saying, how do you take this guy out? Because we've already seen that. We saw it last year during camp. Now, if Florian's a wild card, Owen Beck might be the exact opposite of that. He's probably the safest candidate because Beck's game makes sense in an NHL bottom six. Okay, we've been talking about Owen Beck for years. He wins faceoffs, his defensive awareness, positioning, two-way hockey, his intelligence, his attention to detail. And those are the exact qualities teams tend to value when they're deciding who gets their final roster spot. Now, Beck has 28 games of NHL experience in his pocket too. And last season, he played 15 with Montreal, scoring his first NHL goal while averaging just over 9 minutes. In Laval, he had 13 goals and 20 assists for 33 points in 58 games. And then when the playoffs arrived, he produced 5 points in 5 games, tying for Laval's playoff scoring lead. That sounds like a pretty solid season, and it is. And more importantly, for Beck, it looked like real progress. I don't think anybody needs Beck to become a huge offensive producer. If he does, fantastic. But not necessarily in terms of, creating his path to the Montreal Canadiens. His path is becoming the kind of center coaches trust. I look at Montreal's current roster. You've got Nick Suzuki, Philip Deneau, Jake Evans, Oliver Kapanen, Kirby Dach, Alex Newhook, who could also play center. So there's no shortage of options for Montreal at center, which sounds bad for Beck, but it could actually work in his favor because Beck doesn't necessarily need Montreal to create a scoring line opportunity for him. He can enter lower in the lineup. He can play center, potentially move to the wing when necessary. He can take defensive zone draws. He can eventually contribute to the penalty kill. And he gives Marty St. Louis another player who understands the details of the game. Beck's one of those prospects with a legitimate opportunity to sneak into the opening night roster as an extra forward. I think that is very realistic. But here's what Beck has to prove. He's not simply an NHL replacement player, because we've already established that he can survive NHL games, right? 28 appearances is enough to know that he isn't completely overwhelmed. The next step for him, though, is showing that something happens when he's on the ice. Can he control shifts? Can he create offense from his forecheck? Is he able to make plays with the puck instead of simply making the safe play? And can he become a player St. Louis actively wants in the lineup instead of somebody he's comfortable putting in the lineup? That's the difference between a call-up and a roster player. And that's why this training camp is so important for Beck, because the reputation is already established. Responsible, reliable, smart, good defensively. Now I want to see him make a stronger offensive statement because Montreal doesn't need 50 points from him, but because the fourth line is changing in the National Hockey League. You can't just send 3 players over the boards to defend for 40 seconds anymore. Good teams want 4 lines that spend time in the offensive zone. That's what Carolina had when they beat us in the Eastern Conference Final. And if Beck can show that he can help do that, then I think he's got a legitimate chance at making the team. And if I'm choosing the player most likely to win the 13th forward job, Beck might actually be my favorite right now. But he's still number 2 overall because there's one player in this group that I think has the ability to completely change Montreal's plans. David Reinbacher. This is the guy. Not necessarily the guy most likely to be in the opening night roster, and that's an important distinction. But if you ask me which prospect has the best chance of walking into training camp and forcing Kent Hughes into a decision he wasn't planning to make, it's absolutely David Reinbacher, because the Canadiens don't have another prospect in this group with the same combination of pedigree, position, size, mobility, and potential role. Right? Reinbacher has finally had something that desperately he needed on his resume, a relatively normal year of hockey. After all the injuries and interrupted development, he played 57 games with Laval. He scored 5 goals and 19 assists for 24 points. And more importantly, he finished a plus 18. Then he eventually made his NHL debut. Played 2 games with Montreal, recorded an assist, averaged over 13 minutes a night. I know it's an incredibly small sample, but at this point, I don't think Reinbacher's camp is really about his statistics. It's about the eye test. Does he look like an NHL defenseman? Not eventually, and not after 60 games, but right now. Because if he does, the roster puzzle changes a little bit for you. Montreal's right side is Noah Dobson, Alex Carrier, and then potentially the ability to move somebody else around. Dobson isn't going anywhere, obviously. Carey is an established NHL defenseman, but there have been questions in his game. And Reinbacher has the potential to become exactly the kind of player every contender needs. A big, mobile, right-shot defenseman who can defend, move the puck, and potentially take on very difficult minutes. And unlike Engstrom, Reinbacher isn't trying to duplicate a role Montreal has 3 versions of. His profile is completely different. And that's why I think his path is more interesting. Suppose Reinbacher comes into camp and looks dramatically better. He's gotten beefed up and stronger, closes space better, angles guys to the boards, uses a good stick, closes his gap, moves the puck efficiently, defends rushes, and breaks up plays. I mean, all of a sudden, he's one of Montreal's 6 best defensemen. What do you do at that point? And that's the question you have to ask. Do you say, sorry, David, you're waiver exempt, so you're going back to Laval automatically? You can, and Montreal very well might. But at a certain point, roster management has to give weight to merit. If Reinbacher is ready to help you win NHL games right now, the fact that you can send him down doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And that's where the bigger organizational conversation begins. Carey is entering the final year of his contract. Matheson's an important veteran. You've got Hudson and Dobson as foundational pieces. You've got Gooley. You've got Engstrom pushing. You've got Reinbacher pushing. Eventually, there isn't going to be enough ice time for everybody. And that's a good problem, but it's still a problem. And Reinbacher might be the player who accelerates that timeline. That's why you don't think the goal should be David Reinbacher has to make the Montreal Canadiens. Not even close. The goal should be David Reinbacher has to make Kent Hughes seriously consider changing the roster to accommodate him. And that's a little bit different. And that's what I mean by forcing your way in, because sending him to Laval isn't a failure. If Montreal tells him, we want you to play 22 minutes a night, first penalty kill, tough matchups, come back when we need you, well, that's completely reasonable. But if Montreal reaches the end of camp and Reinbacher has clearly been one of their top 6 better defensemen, that's when things become very interesting. And I think he's capable of creating that conversation given what I've seen from him. So let's put the 4 players side by side for a minute, okay? We'll start with Adam Engstrom, probably closer to the NHL than his roster chances suggest. Excellent season in Laval, real offensive upside, but the left side of Montreal's defense is crowded. He's my player most likely to get squeezed despite playing very well. And you got Florian Xhekaj, who, like I said, is my biggest wild card. He's got a defined identity and a skill set Montreal doesn't have abundance in. You know, his entire case comes down to whether he can bring physicality, forechecking, and intimidation while still playing a disciplined and trustworthy game of hockey. He's my most likely surprise. Owen Beck, he presents the safest profile. Center, responsible, reliable. He's already got 28 NHL games under his belt. He's coming off a 33-point and 58-game season in Laval, and he's an excellent short playoff run there as well. He might be the cleanest fit as Montreal's extra forward. So he's my most likely opening a night prospect. And then there's David Reinbacher, highest upside. Best positional fit and potentially the player whose development could affect Montreal's defense and their structure for years to come. He's my most likely prospect to force management into a difficult decision. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. If you ask me today to predict the opening night roster, I think Montreal can very easily send all 4 players to Laval. And I know that doesn't sound particularly exciting to everybody, but remember, what are we talking about here? This isn't the Canadiens team from 3 years ago. Making the Montreal Canadiens is supposed to be difficult now, and it seems to be. That's what happens when a rebuild works. You eventually reach the point where legitimate NHL caliber prospects don't automatically get jobs. They have to take them away from somebody. And I actually think that this is one of the healthiest developments we've seen within the organization. Because Laval isn't supposed to exist just to produce NHL players as quickly as possible. It's supposed to produce NHL players who are ready to help the team become a winning team. And that's a higher standard. And it changes everything about this training camp. Think about it for a minute, okay? If you ask prospects that were in the Detroit Red Wings organization back in the late 90s and early 2000s, how long did they stay with Adirondack? That's where the Red Wings affiliate was at the time. 4, 5, in some cases 6 years before they even made it to the NHL. And when they did make it to the NHL, their impact was felt and it was never questioned. And maybe that's the same direction Montreal wants to take the development curve. But again, if players are forcing you to make decisions, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, here's a scenario I think would make this camp very interesting. Imagine Beck is excellent. He wins draws, creates offense, defends well, and looks completely comfortable. And at the same time, Florian Xhekaj is running around making life miserable for everybody, but he's playing very responsible hockey. Now, suddenly Montreal isn't deciding whether either player is NHL ready. Now they're deciding whether their 13th forward spot should go to Beck's versatility or Florian's uniqueness. Meanwhile, in defense, Reinbacher starts looking like he belongs, and Engstrom continues creating offense every night. Now Kent Hughes has exactly the problem every general manager claims that he wants. Too many NHL players. And when that happens, somebody above them becomes vulnerable. Maybe not immediately. Maybe Montreal starts the season conservatively, but prospects create pressure. Pressure creates competition, and competition creates roster movement. And that's why I don't think this story ends when the opening night cuts are announced. Maybe Engstrom starts in Laval. Maybe so do Reinbacher, Beck, and Florian. That doesn't mean they're spending their entire season there. So let's not get our panties in a bunch. An injury can happen. Someone struggles. A trade opportunity arises. A veteran becomes expendable. And suddenly, the bubble prospect becomes an NHL regular. Now, the Canadiens are reaching the stage where Laval just isn't supplying emergency call-ups. It's supplying legitimate competition for jobs. And that's a huge difference compared to where this team was 5 years ago. So heading into this camp, how would I rank them based specifically on their chances of forcing their way into the Montreal Canadiens' plans? As I mentioned, number 4, Adam Engstrom. Good enough, possibly ready enough, but facing the worst numbers game. Number 3, Florian Xhekaj. Not necessarily the most polished player, but the most unique, and sometimes being different gives you a clearer road to an NHL job than simply being good. Number 2, Owen Beck. Probably the safest bet if Montreal decides to carry one of these prospects as an extra forward. He's already looked like a player whose strengths translate naturally into a bottom 6 NHL role. And then number 1, David Reinbacher, because I think he has the greatest potential to walk into camp and change the entire conversation. If Reinbacher looks merely solid, God, his name is hard to pronounce, send him to Laval. No problem. If he looks good, things get complicated. And if he looks like one of Montreal's 6 best defensemen, well, then Kent Hughes is going to have some work to do and might have a decision to make that goes well beyond one prospect getting sent down. Because the question becomes, who is he replacing? And that's when a prospect has truly forced his way in. Not when management gives him an opportunity, when management has no choice but to create one. And that's what I'll be watching for in this Canadiens camp, because I don't think the biggest surprise this fall is necessarily going to be one of these 4 making the team. The biggest story might be that Montreal finally has enough depth in the organization that an NHL-ready prospect can play well, get sent down anyway, and still have the organization making the correct decision. That's what organizational depth actually looks like. But sooner or later, somebody is going to make the decision impossible. My pick for that job is David Reinbacher. The question is whether it happens opening night or whether Montreal can hold off on bringing him up for a few more months. Now I want to hear what you think, because I know a lot of you question Reinbacher's health, Reinbacher's injury prone, which isn't the case. But if you could only keep one of these 4 prospects on the opening night roster for the Canadiens, which one would it be? Engstrom, Florian Xhekaj, Owen Beck, or David Reinbacher? Who are you keeping? And more importantly, whose job are you giving them? Now hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel if you already haven't, and make sure you hit the notification bell. Camp is less than a month away, and things are just going to start heating up now, so don't miss out. Once again, I'm Coach K. This is PuckTalk Montreal, and remember, keep your skates down, stick on the ice, go Habs, go.